turbulent. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second lecture in the Tipperary Incantatus series. Before we kick off with that, I just have two things to tell you about. Now, one is Sebastian Barry is coming here to Tipperary Libraries over the weekend. He's visiting Clonmel on Friday at 7:30, and Nina at 3 on Saturday, and here at Curlis at 7 p.m. He's going to read from a long, long way, and he'll discuss the book with readers. And the book centres around Freedon, a young Dublin man who enlists in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and goes to fight in World War I. And then it deals with the realities of war for the young Irish soldier against the turbulent background of 1916. So anybody who would like to come is more than welcome. I have some flyers here or some kind of invitations. You can pick them up afterwards, but even if you don't have one, that doesn't mean you can't come. And if you're looking for any further details, the girl that is dealing with it here is Lorraine, and the number for the branch is 29720. But if you have any difficulty, just ring John and myself and we'll put you through. And the other thing is the Castle Arts Festival invites everybody to a free architecture lecture entitled In Town. It's on tomorrow night at 8 p.m. in Ardmale Church. It's by Orla Murphy, and she presents her research on the history, morphology, character and ritual of Ireland's 233 rural towns. And afterwards our Maid Heritage Society are giving tea and buns, and I can say it's worthwhile going for the tea and buns. So if anybody wants to ask any more about those, they can come up to me afterwards. So anyway, on with tonight's programme. I'd like to welcome Raymond Gillespie, who's going to speak to us on Tipperary manuscripts and their makers from 1500 to 1700. And Raymond teaches history in Maynooth, and as well as that, he has a long, long list of books that he has written and edited over a career of 30 years. So on your behalf, I would like to welcome Raymond. And
thank you very much. Good evening, friends. First of all, when Mary asked me what I might like to talk about, I perhaps rashly said that I would talk about manuscripts which were made in Tipperary, and we are going to be very generous, shall we say, about what we mean by Tipperary. We may wander into the wider ranges of West Kilkenny, perhaps a little bit in the Cork, and perhaps, who knows, in the Laois, if you feel so inclined. Manuscripts are perennially interesting things. I'm sure I've already begun to disappoint you on the issue of manuscripts because there are no pictures. They are perennially interesting even though they are not terribly photogenic. Why should we talk about manuscripts? Why are manuscripts perennially interesting? Well, I think there are a number of reasons why looking at manuscripts and their makers in Tipperary will provide us with an insight into the world of Tipperary that other sources don't do. Now, there are lots of sources for the history of Tipperary, some of them very remarkable in this period. I don't need to tell you all, the importance of that large collection of the Ormond Deeds, which tells a great deal about medieval and early modern Tipperary, or indeed the civil survey of the 1650s, probably the finest of all the civil survey volumes are the volumes for Tipperary, which cast light not just on the point at which they were made in the 1650s, but back into the 16th century. So that, there is a range of stuff out there that we could use to try and reconstruct the society of Tipperary in the 15th, 16th, and early 17th centuries. But so why manuscripts? Why look at these things which, sometimes are frustrating, sometimes are difficult to do? Well, manuscripts have two properties, two very important properties, which help us to get not just a view of the landscape or a view of the buildings in the landscape, but rather a view of what's going on in people's heads and the way in which people organise themselves, like on a daily basis, to make the world work. So what some people call society. Manuscripts, their first problem, of course, is that they have ideas in it. They have writing. People write things down. Therefore, if we look at what manuscripts are moving, exist, and read the texts which are in them, we can get some sort of idea of the things that are influencing people. But perhaps even more important than that, more important than actually what's written in the texts which make up the manuscripts, there is a great deal of evidence about the making of the manuscripts themselves, about how they moved about who owned them, and also in some cases why they owned them. Now, this evidence comes in two forms in manuscripts, which manuscript scholars usually call colophons and marginalia. Now, what are colophons and what are marginalia? Well, colophons are notes written by the man who copied the document at the time that he was copying it. Usually at the end of the document, or sometimes if he breaks halfway through while he's copying it, he will write a note to himself about what's going on and why he stopped here and he's finished copying the first part and he's going to move on. So a colophon is something which is contemporary with the writing of the manuscript, made by the man who wrote the manuscript. Marginalia are those things which librarians don't like. People scribbling in the margins. And where would historians be without them? So, marginalia are comments made perhaps by the person who wrote the manuscript, but sometimes by the person who read it. So we can see something of, how people respond to what they read. Which bits they choose to highlight in their nice yellow highlighter, and which bit they don't. And that can be sometimes very revealing as well. And the great thing about these colophons and marginalia is that unlike, if you like, texts, unlike things which someone sits down very carefully to write and thinks about what's going in and works out, in some precision what he's going to say, makes it all hang together. Colophons sometimes don't work like that. They're very much spur of the moment. It's what's in his head at that moment. So they have an immediacy which most of these other things don't have. They have a drama which, the annalise doesn't have, or an entry in the civil service. Give you an example, the sort of thing I'm talking about. In 1578, a man just over the border in Kilkenny called Cork O'Connell is writing a medical manuscript. He's writing a manuscript which is a version of an ancient text, an ancient medical text, which he is preparing for his own use as a doctor. And we'll come back to what these people were doing a little bit later on. But he scribbles in the age of the margin. This is Paul Walsh's translation of what he scribbles. Here hath finished the second book by the help of the Saviour. And in Taganarona it was begun on the 16th of June. And it was completed while I was in the house of Brian, son of Cahir, son of Art, son of Diarmaid of the Red Man, and Isabella, daughter of A, son of Sean, son of Raymond of Green. Although it was there, it was begun and finished, it was not in the same place the greater part of it was written. It was moving around. And about the 5th day of February it was ended. And about the same time, Sean, son of the Earl of Desmond, was set free. And Sir Henry Sidney, your deputy, delivered him to Garrett, son of James, the present Earl of Warren. And this Sir Henry we speak of as Lord Justice of Ireland. And he is also the person who most thoroughly reduced Ireland to submission of the English, since they first came into the country, and more particularly within the memory of all now who are alive. And the sovereign of all England and Ireland now is Queen Elizabeth. Many say that she hath also the sovereignty of Scotland and of France. And there is no dignity, as great as all these combined. The English say that she is invested also with the supremacy of religion. But in that they assert an untruth. For we are convinced that the head of the Holy Catholic Church is the Pope. In a sense, what the English say is correct. For the Queen is the head of the false faith entirely, and so insofar under her jurisdiction. Because in her domain there is neither abstinence, nor fast, nor ember days, nor holidays, which God hath ordered to be observed. Neither is there any given respect or honour to any holy house since she attained to power. And her subjects too, the most addicted to murder and to self-conceit in the whole European continent. And it is a matter of surprise to me that God tolerates them so long in authority, except that he beareth patiently, and his vengeance cometh slowly and directly. An additional point, the Irish themselves are bad, and that heaven hath provided them with castigation at another turn of history, and we shall not discuss this at length. For we should waste our ink and our paper with the things that we have suggested. I implore O'Connor, who wrote this, and let everyone who shall read it render a prayer for my soul, and let not any great reader blame me for any portion that has been badly set down, for I am exceeding great haste, and I am able to remain for a short time, 1578. The mercy of the King of Heaven to the author of this book, Bernardus Gordonius, who gave it to the world, and to him who translated it into Irish, namely Cormac O'Donnell, and to him who wrote it here. May the Saviour complete the third book. And that is the most, I think, immediate reaction I know to anyone from the 16th century talking about their own work, buried in the middle of a medieval manuscript. And it's a reaction, I think, which is not thought out, because you will have noticed there are contradictions in it. That Elizabeth's bad, but the Irish are equally bad. So he hasn't sat down and worked out a very careful scheme. So these colophons and marginalia have an immediacy. They tell us about what people believe, about popular belief, about what they thought about the world, about what they thought about politics, about what they thought about the people around them, who they knew. So these are quite remarkable documents. These are quite remarkable small inserts into things that sometimes don't quite look what they're meant to be. So manuscripts are important for those sorts of things. Why Irish manuscripts, you may say, in Tipperary? Surely, Tipperary was an area of Anglo-Norman influence. It was a place where the Anglo-Normans ruled for most of the Middle Ages, and therefore it should have been a word that was absorbed into England, into the world of common law, into the world of English colonisation. Now that view, if you like, comes from our view of how we look at Ireland in this period. We tend to think now of Ireland being east-west. The divisions between the east, the Anglo-Norman settlement, and the west, the native Irish. But in fact, in the 16th century, Ireland was a country which wasn't about east-west. In fact, it was linked together by the Shannon. The Shannon was a tremendously important waterway. And the Shannon links Tipperary to the powerhouse, the place where most Irish manuscripts were made, that is, Roscommon, and the way and the parts of Mayo in this period. So manuscript makers continually moved up and down the Shannon, arriving in Tipperary, bringing with them their manuscripts, bringing with them their expertise, bringing with them a whole set of ideas, which imported ideas from Roscommon, Mayo, down into Tipperary. So Tipperary was being exposed not to some sort of Irish threat from the west, which sometimes what the textbooks say, but in fact Tipperary is being drawn into a world of the north. And we will see time and again that many of the people who made manuscripts in Tipperary came from that world. Even if you go into Meath, perhaps the core of the Pale, in the 1570s, the Plunketts of Meath decided they wanted a manuscript, an Irish manuscript. It's now a manuscript which is in Oxford, Bodleian Library, belongs in B512. And what is in who made this manuscript for them? An Omni O'Connell scribe. And where do the Omni O'Connells come from? Roscommon. So that these people, like, are moving up and down the Shannon, bringing ideas from the north into the south, and particularly into Tipperary. That's not to say, of course, that, Tipperary didn't have its own scribes. Indeed, Tipperary and West Kilkenny could boast some of the best known and the finest scribes of the late 15th and the 16th centuries. A man, for example, called William Magdalene, for example, is working in this area producing manuscripts. Fairly standard stuff, but also some quite remarkable stuff. Because he is not being bound by what we might describe as the traditional canon of Irish manuscript making. He's translating continental tracts into Irish. He's translating English tracts into Irish. He is translating and transcribing some of the cutting-edge, most fashionable tracts of their day. Guy of Warwick, Late Medieval English Romance, translated by him and put into circulation in this area. So that what you get, therefore, is some very distinguished scribes indeed working in this area, some local scribes, if you want to call them that, although they are much more than that, mixing with people who are coming down the Shannon, bringing their expertise with them. And we'll encounter some of those as we go along. Now, scribes, the problem of making manuscripts, of actually trying to put manuscripts together, we know a lot about some of these people. And we know a lot about them, about the process of making these manuscripts from these things that I've talked about, the colophons and the marginalia. Scribes, we think of perhaps sitting in splendid isolation, in a nice, quiet room, happily writing out their manuscript or their paper. In fact, it was sometimes a relationship which was rather more dramatic than that. One manuscript that has a lot of these notes, which allows us to think a little bit about how manuscripts were made and how the relationship worked between paper and scribe, is a very interesting manuscript which is known by lots of different names. The Book of Popelrath is one of them. It's now an Oxford manuscript called 610. It's made up of two bits of different dates. The first date, the first volume, made between 1410 and 1450. For the Fourth Earl of Ormond, made partly in Tipperary, partly in Kilkenny. And the second part, made in the 1450s for a man in Butler, with perhaps 4 or 5 scribes involved in putting it together. Now, these scribes were not sitting in, a pleasant situation. One of them writes in the margin, in Odd 610, "May everyone who reads it," the book he's writing, "give his blessing on Edmund Butler, for it is tireless of him to be trying to write it the day after raiding into Ossory yesterday where there was much plunder." So, a scribe went on raids. A scribe sometimes fell out of his table. May God forgive him who makes us write on a Sunday night. Namely, Edmund Butler. We are in Popelrath tonight. Upon my word, another marginal one. Upon my word, it is a great penance to keep us on water on Good Friday, considering the good wine that is in the house in Popelrath. And again, I think it long for Edmund to be out in the frost while I wait for him to fight my dinner. But at the other side of the equation, Here is the scribe writing about his paper. I do not like Edmund to be sleeping in front of the window on the windy side. So that he's worried about his paper. And again, in 15, another scribe who actually dates it, 1454. My curse on the naughty no, for it has bitten the child, the son of Pierce, son of Edmund, son of Richard Butler. You see, there's a very immediate word where scribes are not people who live remote from the word, but are very much part of it. Are very much part of the daily life of reading, of popular devotion. Okay, so we can, given that manuscripts are important, that these notes will tell us a great deal about how they were made, about what people think of them. We can think about three groups. What sort of manuscripts are made? We can think about three big groups. Let's call it about 1,500 of manuscripts, which are floating around in Tipperary. First, there are old manuscripts. That is, manuscripts which have been made a long time ago, which people are collecting and building up libraries. Because there are libraries being built up in Tipperary at this stage. There are lots of different reasons for putting a library together, for collecting these manuscripts. Some are not professional. Some of these people make their living using manuscripts. We'll come back to these people again. But they build up libraries to use. Now, perhaps the most famous of these in Tipperary is McGee's, family. Lawyers by tradition and by training. One of the great learned families from Ballymcgeegan, you may know where it is, they're just not Laura, who have a very substantial estate there. And in the early 16th century, they have a very substantial library. We can reconstruct what some of this is, because some of their manuscripts have survived. Perhaps the most famous manuscript which they have is a manuscript called the Larbrack Spec Book. A manuscript which includes sermons, devotional tracts, religious works of all sorts. They have another manuscript which we now know as in the Royal Irish Academy as manuscript 3D22. But what's that? It's a collection of religious works. It has, for example, the Rule of the Culties from Cala, a manuscript which they had in the 15th century and which in the 17th century had passed into the hands of the Kennedys. So it's a manuscript which is moving around in Tipperary. They have a manuscript which is known as the Red Book of Maggie, the Red Book of Maggie, that Geoffrey Keating in the early 17th century saw. We don't know what that is, but we do know that there is a manuscript in the British Library now, which is additional manuscript 30512, which was probably in the hands of Maggie and has nice red letters, the Red Book of Maggie. And we know they had a set of annals. We know this because in the 17th century, another man, a manuscript collector called James Ware, saw a thing which he called the Annals of Clunain, which he saw in the hands of a man called Flanagin. Now, in all these manuscripts, there are no law manuscripts. Yet these are lawyers. So we must presume they must have had a lot more than this. But clearly they were very interested in religion. So that the sort of manuscripts which they're building up, the things they're collecting, tell us a lot about their minds, about what they're interested in. And even these lawyers are deeply interested in theology at this time. So there are libraries of the professional class, of the lawyers. But there are lawyers, but there are manuscripts which are in the hands of people other than lawyers. There are manuscripts which are owned by families. I mentioned one of them already, the Lord 610. Why did some people want to collect these manuscripts? Why did great lords want to collect manuscripts? Well, one of the reasons, of course, is that manuscripts are mystical things. we think of a manuscript as something which, you read. But in fact, in the 15th and 16th centuries, in a society which was largely oral, where most people could not read or write, where the professional classes did the reading and writing, manuscripts were strange things. People gazed upon them in wonder. So the manuscript itself was important, regardless of what went into it. There are lots of examples of this. Some of the most famous examples, if you go way up to the O'Donnells in the north, a Catholic, a manuscript of the Psalms, which was carried before the O'Donnells in battle to protect them. It had almost mystical properties. Again, the O'Donnells raided into Connacht frequently in the 14th centuries to get particular manuscripts because they were thought to be particularly magical. The Larney era, the oldest manuscript with Irish in it that survives, was raided by the O'Donnells specifically to get that manuscript from Connacht in the 1470s. Now, the most famous of those manuscripts, which had, if you like, mystical associations, in Tipperary, was, of course, a manuscript known as the Psalter of Cashel. Now, the Psalter of Cashel is rather like a Ferrari. If you think about the good times, 50 years ago, everybody wanted a Ferrari. And particularly if you had no idea what was going on the bottom, you wanted it even more. Because it was a status symbol. The Psalter of Cashel was a status symbol. But the reality was that most people had no clue what was in it. But you wanted a copy of the Psalter of Cashel. It was a manuscript that traditionally was ascribed to Bishop, King of Munster, or Cormac Colman, who died in 908. It was traditionally thought to contain genealogies, it contained stories, it contained all sorts of things. And when you start to look at the sort of things that people have that they call the Psalter of Cashel, suddenly you begin to realise there probably is no Psalter of Cashel. There is lots of manuscripts being sold as the Psalter of Cashel, but no one is terribly clear what is in them. In this manuscript I talked about, 1610, made for the Earl of Ormond, part in Tipperary, partly in Kilkenny. The scribe says he is taking stuff out of the Psalter of Cashel. And what he's transcribing, in fact, is the martyrology of Angus, 9th century martyrology in Ireland. That's what he thinks the Psalter of Cashel. And clearly he passes it on to other people, because in the 1520s, the Earl of Kildare and Maynooth, in his library list, says he has a copy of the Psalter of Cashel too. Doesn't tell you what's in it, but since he was forced to before the Earl of Kildare, he probably got a copy of this manuscript. In 1619, Bishop Rolf of Ossory said he had the Psalter of Cashel. Except what was in his Psalter of Cashel was a list of the succession of Patrick, a collection of enchantments or lower places, and a collection of genealogies. Geoffrey Keating, in the 1630s, had a Psalter of Cashel as well. It certainly had genealogies in it, but a copy of an Argawalla, which nobody else says is in the Psalter of Cashel. Micheál Cleary, the author of the Annals of the Four Masters, he also copies parts of the Psalter of Cashel in 1627, Kildare. What he's copying of is something which looks very like another manuscript, at this time a Leinster manuscript, known as the Book of Leinster. A man called Conall McGain, in 1627, writes the Annals of Clonmacnoise. He sees the Psalter of Cashel too, he says it. Except his Psalter of Cashel is not by Cormac Colman at all. His Psalter of Cashel is made by Brian Baroon between 1002 and 1014. And he gives a very detailed description of what is in this Psalter of Cashel. He says that Brian Baroon got everything together and he caused them to compose a book containing all the inhabitants, events, of sects that lived in this land, or the history, from the first peopling to the present, which book he called the Psalter of Cashel. Signed it with his own hand, together with the hands of the kings of the 5 provinces, and all the bishops and prelates of the kingdom. And he caused several copies to be made and given to the kings of all the provinces, the strict charge that no credit should be given to any chronicle thenceforth, except this one. In 1673, a man called Raymond Gillespie sees the Psalter of Cash, this time in Oxford. He says it's a saint's life. It's a book of Simple of Ram, which is the real Psalter of Cash. It doesn't really matter, because you don't need to know what's going on inside. You don't need to know how the engine works. But the Psalter of Cash is powerful stuff. So manuscripts had images. They had authority. That they were the sort of prestige things which you wanted to own in order to say, I've got this coffee table. So we have manuscripts which were old, which people were collecting either because they were of the learned families and they were interested in what was going on, or because they wanted prestige items to show to their friends, to say, I have the Psalter of Cash. Once you say Psalter of Cash, it rings all sorts of bells in people's heads. This is status symbol stuff. Second sort of manuscripts which are floated about are manuscripts which are written at the request of patrons. Somebody comes along to the scribe and says, you write me a manuscript, please. Especially for me. And there are lots and lots of different types of patrons around who want this done. The most obvious group, I suppose, patrons who are floating around are institutions, the church. Every church is dedicated to the saint. Every church wants a copy of a saint's life, of the life of that saint, for all sorts of reasons. And we know that lots of churches did ask scribes to put together a volume for them. Sometimes relations are not great. If you look in the National Library of Scotland, there is a manuscript written for the parish of Raymond. Some of you may know it's just south of Mitchelstown. And it's a life of the saint of the parish. And there's a note at the end of it, a colophon, which says, I am Conor, and health and greeting from me to the vicar and parson of Brigobon. That's Brigobon. And to Robert. And let them buy as they promised to do this life of renewal. And let it be known that Dennis O'Donnell is a devoted friend of mine. And I have done what I promised. And the church should bear the cost of this book. And not let the clerics imagine that they can have it by charity or prayer. But let them send its price to me and pay. And let them pray for the souls of their own friends. And they are not to roll this book up, as is the constant habit of clerics and physicians, nor give it in loan, nor allow a copy to be made from it, but carefully preserve it under lock and key. So sometimes relations between the scribe who's making the book and the people who master it are very straightforward commercial decisions. Make me a copy of it. Thank you. Here's the money. The second, and lots of people want it, lots of institutions want these. But there's a second sort of relationship which is floating about that we've had a hint of already. And that is not an institution wants a copy of a manuscript, but an individual wants a copy of a manuscript. A lord who wants a copy of a manuscript, perhaps the Psalter of Cashel, perhaps something else which he would like to have. And we have a number of examples of this sort of thing going on. For example, that manuscript which we now know in the British Library as Harding said in the is a manuscript written by that family that I mentioned earlier on, the Old Mill Congress, the Rolls-Royce scribes of the 16th century, for New Berners, for Wicklow family. What's in this manuscript? Stories about the history of Ireland. Stories which could be told and retold, particularly the stories of the time, that is the story, one of the great foundational stories of the capital Raymond Gillespie. It's foretales, it's after tales, the sort of things that would entertain people of an evening. And that a scribe would produce a copy of this for that one particular family, for example, in order to give it something to entertain. Something where stories could be retold from. Sometimes those stories are St. Scribes. That manuscript that we call the Book of the More, for example, is that sort of manuscript. Now, we've already seen the sort of conditions that these were made in. These were made not where there is a straightforward commercial transaction between a lord and follower, a lord and scribe, hand over the money, please. Here, the scribe will very often go to the Lord's house, will live as part of the Lord's family. For example, we've seen Law 610 has been made, that is that Ormond manuscript. The scribe is living in the Lord's house, being fed by the Lord, being part of the Lord's family. So that the relationship between the scribe and his patron is rather different to the sort of relationship that we've seen working with Britain, with the church. It's a relationship which is much more paternalistic, and it's a relationship which has nothing to do with anything called as money. That the Lord will look after you, and you in return will give him a gift. And the gift is the manuscript. It's a word of lordship. It's the same word we like dealing with scribes as it is the word that we're dealing with poets. A poet would write you a poem, and in return you would have everlasting fame. We know there were lots of these poems in Tipperary, some of them have been edited. So that the Lord will write you a manuscript, the scribe will write you a manuscript, and you will have everlasting fame because you have a manuscript, and in return the Lord will look after you. A word like a paternalistic word, a word of lordship. So a rather different sort of environment in which some of these manuscripts are made, like Law 610, for example. The third sort of manuscripts which are floating about in Tipperary in the 16th century are the manuscripts which are made by learned families for their own use. That is, if you like, doctors, lawyers, poets, historians actually accumulate a material which they often in school, often as school books, which they will then use again and again and again to satisfy their patrons later in life. Now, we don't actually have any of these for a Tipperary context. We have one or two which essentially are not school manuscripts, but which are medical manuscripts from a Tipperary context. But then we have some of these from other contexts. Very specialist works. A manuscript known as Royal Irish Academy 2310, written in 1575, up in Roscommon, in the family of the owner of Commons. Very specialist manuscript. In most of it in Old Irish, which very few people in the 16th century could have understood. So written for a very specialist technical audience. Again, that manuscript called 55280, written for the Claries, again, a very technical manuscript, full of Old Irish, very difficult language. This was for the learned, that they would draw material out. So school books helped the learned later in life, and they kept these books. Medical manuscripts were equally practical. And there are lots and lots of medical manuscripts which are floating around in Tipperary, and particularly in West Kilkenny in the late 16th century. There are a number of very important medical schools which are producing these manuscripts. We've seen Cork called up already, scribbling away happily in the margins of his manuscript, telling us about his world. But equally, there are lots of people doing exactly the same thing. And medical manuscripts had very long lives. We know this because of the notes that people write in the margin. So that manuscripts, for example, that were made in the 1570s were still in the 1690s being used for the purpose for which they were being used. So then doctors would make manuscripts, would copy out medical treatises that they would refer to later on, and they would bequeath them to their sons, who would also be doctors. One doctor in Kilkenny, called Richard O'Connor, writes at the bottom of a medical manuscript that he makes in 1590, I bequeath possession of this volume in conformity with the custom of men of science, namely, that it should not be given to the descendant who is oldest in years or richest, unless he also be the most learned. And if in that way the disposal of books were always made good, much good would come of it, and it would be very great in the diminution of ignorance among those who own them. So the manuscripts were made and passed down through families because these technical families, these medical families, actually used them and used them for medicine. Law as well. We have a very fine collection of law manuscripts which are made by a family connected to the Big E's in a law school in the borough, which are made by students learning the law, learning how to run the world. So these manuscripts again are passed down from family to family, and they were used. Now, these are often made by people not sitting in one place, but moving about, and moving about often very quickly. Just to give you a sense of what one man would do, or how one scribe might try to work, let me give you a little bit of one medical manuscript, again by this man Richard O'Connor, who is in Kilkenny at the beginning. He starts off, here finished the third particle of the Lays of Medical text. So, with the help of the Saviour on the 18th of November, far distant from one another are the places in which this book is written. For none of my temporal lords remain, and my parents too are dead, and I myself have neither wife nor home. All I could do when I was tired in one place was to transport myself to another. And indeed I did not write a week's work of it, except in the house of a kinsman or a kinswoman or some great friend of my own. There was no king. This has been made for him, in the houses of himself and his friends. And he gives a whole sermon where he goes all around Kilkenny, into Tipperary, into Kildare. And who are all his friends? Who does he stay with? Where does he write? And that he, at the end, he gives a long genealogy of Queen Elizabeth. So again, interesting, he's telling you what he may think about the Queen, that he seems to hold the Queen in great respect, notwithstanding his Irish statement. So that what we have, therefore, there are these professional books being made, being passed about. Being passed about, with great enthusiasm. Now, how long did it take a scribe to write it? Well, we don't know. It is the simple answer. Except that sometimes they tell us when the manuscript was started and when it's finished. There's one medical manuscript in the Royal Irish Academy, actually rejoices in the name of 2414, but it's by this man, Corporal Colwell, we talked about before. And he says that he started this medical manuscript on the 16th of June 1577, and he finished it on the 15th of February the following year. That's 8 months, roughly. And it's a manuscript of 328 pages. So, roughly, what's he doing? About 40 pages a month. So he's doing about a page and a little bit a day. And indeed, that's seems to be pretty average. Because Tim O'Neill, for example, has worked out from the notes on the Law of Bragg, manuscript owned by the Mahegans, just north of Laurel, that from the notes which say when they started and when they finished, they were doing about a page a day as well. So this is fairly painstaking work, producing these manuscripts. It's also not always the easiest of work. We've heard some of the complaints about being cold, or the not getting their wine. They were often writing by candlelight, so not terribly easy to see sometimes. But these guys had the technical ability to write, which very few other people had. They had the technical ability to use quills, to use ink, to use parchment, to use paper. Paper's only beginning to come in, and they're having some difficulty adjusting the paper to start with. For example, back to our friend Caller again, at the age of Kilkenny and Tipperary, Kilkenny border, he writes a note in his manuscript. He says, I am sad because of the poor quality of my paper and the imperfection of letters that I sent down, for I am unable to procure vellum. Nevertheless, I do not abandon hope of putting it down in good paper. Vellum, of course, was calfskin, which in the certainly up in the middle of the 16th century, all Irish manuscripts were written on. Paper was the new technology. In other words, Coca-Cola had upgraded his computer and he couldn't quite get the hang of it. So they knew how to work with technology. The vellum, which they knew very well, the paper, which they were only getting to know. These were the specialists, the writing specialists. If your manuscript went wrong, you didn't mess about with it yourself. You got in a technical, you got in a specialist. When Lord 610 flees in the early 16th century, they don't mess about with it themselves. They get in and Roman Conroy, a scribe, you remember, from the heartland of Irish scribe practice up in Roscommon, and he re-inks it. That's quite common. Lots of manuscripts are re-inked in that way. But most importantly, the scribes have the technical ability to produce these manuscripts. But even more important than that, they have the exemplars. That is, they have the material to make these manuscripts from. Because if you're copying a manuscript, you have to have it to copy it from something. And it's very important, the power of the scribe in this world derived, partly because he could write, but other people could write as well. But partly because if you went to someone and said, I want a copy of the Psalter of Cassia, he had to have a copy of the Psalter of Cassia to make it from. So therefore, the exemplars which the scribes own are their most powerful bargain to make other manuscripts. You've seen already, remember the scribe, breakdown, just mentioned this time, says, I'll make you this manuscript, if you are not the copy. That is, I am keeping the exemplar. He doesn't want copies floating around time and time again. And of course, the most famous example of this, example we will all know, and no wonder of Tipperary here, but it is such a good example, is the story of Columkill. You want to know this story? And the making of the copy of the samples. And it goes before the king gives judgment, every card's counted and every book is copied. What's that all about? It's all about the fact that poets, you're not to copy the poet's manuscripts. That's very important. You're not to copy the poet's manuscripts. So the winner in all this are the poets. And the message of that story is that poets are the guys who will keep the originals. So that judgment, and that judgment is a very interesting judgment, because it only appears at that point. It doesn't appear in any of the earlier lives of Columkill. It appears at that point, partly because the poets are getting worried about people making copies. So that therefore, what you're seeing there is a world of manuscript making with a very powerful group who have the technology and who have the knowledge and who have the exemplars. The emergence of the scribes who can make copies for you. They make copies for themselves, they make copies for the patrons, all sorts of patrons they have different relationships with. And these then go into circulation, which are then built up into libraries. So this is really a quite sophisticated world that we're talking about here in Tipperary at the middle of the 16th century. What happened to it? How did it vanish? Did it vanish? did it perhaps still float around? We're accustomed to think that somehow, in 1603, when the scholars tell us, after the end of the 9 Years' War, suddenly Bardic poetry disappears. Therefore, this is a collapse of a whole order. And it's related very much to war, conquest, and colonization. In fact, the story is much more complicated than that. Some manuscripts, of course, do fall out of use because the context changes. The most obvious example of this, of course, is law. Law manuscripts stop being made. No point. Bren, or Irish law, is no longer practiced. Common law has become the norm. So there is no point in trying to produce new law manuscripts because they're of no good to anyone. There is an attempt, however, by some of the learned in Tipperary, in one of the law manuscripts, one of the law families, to rewrite parts of the law and make it more amenable to English common law. But it doesn't do it. One manuscript in Trinity tries to do this stuff. It's not doing it. So in the end, it is the end of, if you like, the law tradition, the law manuscript tradition. Because the legal system changes. And that's linked to conquest and colonization. Medical manuscripts, on the other hand, have a much, much longer life. Medical manuscripts continue to be made in Irish, continue to be made in this area, right into the late 17th century. And continue to be used an awful lot longer than that. Because we know, again, as I said before, because of the notes, we know when these manuscripts are still floating around and are still being used. So, they're still being used by doctors in the traditional way, well into the 18th century. Now, much more interestingly, of course, is the question of literary manuscripts. These manuscripts that we talked about, manuscripts which are made in patrons, manuscripts which are made, if you like, for the literary families, the student notebooks. Now, these become, if you like, shall we say, much less common. Partly because there is, no real demand for them. But why is there no real demand for them? Now, here I think we can learn something quite interesting. If we start to follow the history of some of these manuscripts that I've been talking about, let's take the Mohegan's. Remember that great library of Mohegan's that assembled in North Tipperary in the late 15th and the early 16th century? What happens to them? Well, they don't disappear in the 1620s. Micheál O'Clair, the Franciscan, who was the former pastor, visits Mohegan, sees some of the manuscripts that he had, Conrad of Lawn, for example, and makes copies of them. In 1640, Richard Bellings, the man lawyer, a man who will later go on to be Secretary of the Confederation of Kent, writes to the Earl of Ormond and talks about a man called John MacRegan, a.k.a. Flan MacRegan, the man who Micheál O'Clair had met earlier on. And what is John MacRegan doing? He's writing the history of Ireland. He is collecting together manuscripts, and he has access, says Devlin, to a lot of manuscripts. This is very common, it seems, because if you look at other learned families, for example, the O'Ruddy family, who have been heirs of Fina and Leitrim, in the 16th century they had commissioned a history of the church. In the late 17th century, the O'Ruddys are collecting manuscripts. Why? They're writing the history of Ireland. In other words, why do people want manuscripts now? They don't want them because they're good to show off anymore. They don't want them to fit into their libraries. They want them for a different reason. The context of patronage has changed. The context of patronage has now become not so much the prestige value of manuscripts, but has now become the utility value of manuscripts. The use that these old manuscripts can be put to in understanding the history of Ireland. So people are looking now for old manuscripts. The tradition is far from being dead. People are starting to look for Irish manuscripts and indeed to copy Irish manuscripts in Irish again. Where do they get these books? Where does Keating, Geoffrey Keating in Tipperary, in the 1620s and 1630s, who again is writing a history of Ireland, where does he get his manuscripts? Well, there are several people you can go to. You can go to a manuscript broker, a man who has friends. One of the most famous of these is a man called Colin McGagan in Tipperary, in Westmeath, but we'll pass him by quickly. But he is a man who becomes a friend of Keating, friend of Usher's, friend of O'Cleary's, friend of everybody's. So that some of the most important manuscripts for late medieval Ireland end up in Tipperary. Largely because of Colin McGagan's effort. So the Fleck, for example, ends up in Tipperary. For example. You can, if you like, get them like that. More importantly, you can buy them. Let's follow the Psalter of Cashel here, whatever it may have been. We've seen the Psalter of Cashel. No one quite knows what it is, but they all know it's important. Historians start to say how important it is in the annals of Port and Geoffrey Keating and so on. But by the early 18th century, nothing has changed. Anthony Raymond, for example, points out that in the 1690s, a man called Edward Lewis, a Welshman, says the Psalter of Cashel is in Oxford. It's now safe in the Bodleian Library. Anthony Raymond says it's in Ireland somewhere. And there's a third man called Dermot O'Connor, who is happily making money copying out bits of the Psalter of Cashel for people. And Raymond says that O'Connor said of which he did make trade of begging money from the gentry of this country by copying the Psalter of Cashel. It's also called copying our manuscript, which he calls the Psalter of Tara, which never really existed. But the point about this is, where is all this happening? It's not happening in Tipperary anymore, it's happening in Dublin. And again, Archbishop King, in the 1720s, gets a copy of the Psalter of Cashel, whatever it may have been. But it's all happening in Dublin. And no longer is the relationship between the scribe and the paper one of paternalism, one of the culture of lordship. It's not a culture of money. It's a commercialization of the world, which is changing the nature of the manuscript tradition. So the Tipperary manuscripts that previously have been transcribed in Tipperary are now moving their way gradually and inexorably to Dublin, where they are being copied for these new papers, the people who are interested in the history of Ireland. And that these new papers, these people who are now interested in manuscripts, are no longer the great lords. They're now individuals, no longer a word of lordship. They're now individuals sitting by themselves making copies for their own interest or for the money that they can get for the manuscripts by selling them. So in the 1720s, Thomas O'Sullivan, his famous description, example of the making of Geoffrey Keating's Fas Fas and Rare, he talks about Keating having fled the wrath of a parishioner because he had said something unfortunate to the wife of Mr. Buckler. And he says that he lurked in the abodes of the learned. I quote, "Were meeting with a good store of old books and manuscripts to divert his thoughts, he would now and then look over some copy and copy out what he took a fancy of, which being continued for about 2 years in several places, he at last completed his collection, which goes under his name." You transcribe, you copy what you're interested in, no longer what your Lord asks or what you need from your job. It's now become manuscripts have now become the world of the antiquarian. So the world, if you like, of the manuscript tradition never really died. It didn't collapse from after 1603. There were far more 18th century manuscripts being copied in Irish than there were in the 16th century. So the world is changing. The framework, if you like, for the making of manuscripts is shifting. So the making of manuscripts is an art which continues and will continue to